Chapter 16. So it went by, another winter, one day after another. Not a word had Olaf ever uttered about his meeting with Burs at Dramtorp, and Eirik took good heed not to ask him questions. Indeed, they seldom spoke to one another. Their footing was the same as it had been when he was a boy. His father sat and stared, and Eirik did not know whether the man was looking at him or through him at something else. If he had to speak to Olaf about anything, it seemed as if his father only listened to him with half an ear, and a breath of ill will and unfriendliness smote him in the presence of the old man. Eirik remembered that in former days his father's manner had nearly driven him frantic. Now he thought, God knows, perhaps even then he had had a secret burden on his soul. And he felt that his affection for his father had grown firmer of late years, like all else within him, had, as it were, solidified. It was bad for Cecilia and Jorund that he should be so unsociable, but there was no helping it. As far as he could, Eirik associated with the young married couple in the women's house. He had given up pondering over his brother-in-law's behaviour, was inclined to think the man must have been unsettled in his mind during the autumn and winter, and now he seemed to be rid of his venom for this time. All through the latter part of the winter, Jorund Reaper was in good humour, chatty and cheerful, like his old self. He played with his children, showed affection for his wife, sometimes in a way that made Eirik blush. Nor could he help thinking that Cecilia disliked it too, but she did not betray herself. She discharged her share of the household duties with the greatest diligence, and Eirik saw that the housefolk would have been ready to go through fire for their young mistress. Cecilia could even force her father to rouse himself when she wished to consult him. Never did Eirik see a sign that Jorund gave a thought to what had happened at Yuletide, or troubled himself about what rumours it had given rise to. There was talk among the neighbours, Eirik could tell that, but no one hinted anything to him. This too he knew. Had it been two poor men who had been involved in a case of receiving stolen goods, they would not have escaped without being branded for life, at the very least. But he and Jorund were the sons of Gunnarsby and Hestviken, and their kinsmen were Bard of Skikkelstad, who was one of the mightiest men of the countryside, especially since he had married off all his 4 daughters so wisely, and Torgrim of Ringel, who could say and do as he pleased. Most men liked him for all that, and bore with his rough tongue. Even the man who was the victim of it could console himself that tomorrow someone else would be made to feel it. Eirik acknowledged the truth of all that had been said by the Holy Fathers. The judgment of men, world prosperity, and all such things now seemed so small in his eyes that he could only wonder how anyone cared to strive so hard for them as they did, with pain and grief, with cunning, treachery, and violence. Had it not been for Gunhild and the love that was between them, had it not been that Cecilia and Jorund needed his support, he would gladly have let all else go, and today rather than tomorrow. But he was now beginning to see the meaning of being in the world and not of the world. He felt there was nothing more that could subdue his inmost freedom and peace of mind. One day, early in spring, Eirik accompanied his sister up to Ringel. She wished to see her child that was being brought up there. He sat with Una in her weaving room, watching Cecilia as she led her son across the floor. Torgil's Jorund's son had learnt to walk since his mother saw him last. Then Torgrim came in. After a while, the master of the house said, "You may have heard, Eirik, that Gunhild has a new suitor." He mentioned a man whom Eirik did not know, even by name, a man from Agder. Burse will not learn wisdom by experience. He had his way with Eldred's marriage, and it turned out as it did. In spite of that, he means to sell Gunhild into the hands of another old troll." Brother and sister rode homeward in the twilight. Beyond the thick tangle of the alder's foliage, the first great stars were shining in the clear sky. It was a mild evening. The raw scent of earth rose from the bare brown surface, and the birds sang in every grove. They had ridden a long while in silence when the sister said, "Eirik, that news that Thorgrim brought you of Gunhild. It is our fault that you are to lose her." "Gunhild will not submit to be forced," said Eirik. "Forced? There are so many ways," answered Cecilia. After a pause, Eirik said, "Since we have begun to speak of such things, and do not answer if you are unwilling, has Jorund ever troubled you with his suspicions that everyone is against him?" "How have you found that out?" she asked with warmth. "That time last winter, when he seemed beside himself. He accused everyone. You did not escape either." "Oh, I am partly to blame for it myself," said Cecilia. "I was so young then. I knew no better than to provoke him by my silence, and provoke him by what I said." "Young," thought Eirik. "She is not so old as Gunhild." Cecilia said after a while, "I acted wrongly too, I don't doubt. The others were going to a feast. I refused to go with them, chiefly because I was so far gone with Kolbein at the time. But I knew, too, that they had a guest in that house, one who I was not minded to meet. But in the evening he came to Gunnarsby, and I went out nevertheless and spoke to him by the gate. We did not say a word that Jorund himself might not have heard. That is not his way. But Jorund came to hear of it, and he knew the man had known me at Hestviken. You don't know him. Then I was stubborn, and Jorund lost his temper. He has never done such a thing since. It gave him a fright when father came. Indeed, Jorund is a reasonable man between these fits of his." "But it can never be a sin," thought Eirik, "if I urge Gunhild to resist." Some days later Eirik went down to Saltviken. All through the winter he had looked forward to doing the spring work on his farm. Now he set about it, but at the same time his thoughts wandered to other things. He could not get over what he had guessed from his sister's words. Even that insult had been offered Cecilia, who had certainly never let any man touch her, even when she was a child. And then there was the thought of Gunhild. It was the finest of weather every day. Now the manure was dug in on his new dark-soiled cornfields, blending its good warm smell with the acrid scent of growing grass in the meadows. Where the soil was thin over the rocks, the pansies already showed blue. The first shoots on the trees shone bright as pale green flames against the sunlight. Little green leaves had appeared already. The boughs of his cherry trees were pearly with buds. Here and there a branch beside the sun-warmed rock had burst into white blossom. In the midday rest Eirik went down to the bay, undressed, and swam out. The water was still cold, but otherwise it was like summer down here on the beach. The day he had finished sewing, he stopped work at the middle of the afternoon and changed his clothes. He kept a blue kirtle here, so that he might go to church without passing round by Hestviken. Then he rode inland toward Icelander. There had been a flock of children at the homestead where he had put up his horse when he was last in these parts. He now made his way thither, found a half-grown girl who was washing clothes in the brook. He took out some small silver coins and asked if she would go an errand for him. "Then run away to Icelander. See if you can speak with Gunnhild alone. You are to ask her if she has any message for the owner of this token." He took out of his bosom an embroidered shirt-sleeve. Gunnhild had given it to him at Yule when they were together at Ringel, and promised him its mate for Easter. He lay on the grass above the little farm. The woman came up and began to talk to him. From her he learnt that Burs and his wife were not at home. They had gone southward down the fjord a week before, but the place was being made ready to receive guests on the return of the master and mistress. So it was a good thing, after all, that he had made his way hither, he thought. At sunset the little girl came running down the road. Eirik went to meet her. She handed him back the token. "Gunnhild bade me bring greetings and say, you are to ask the owner of this token to ride to the ness with all speed, and wait there. He shall there be given all he is to receive according to the covenant." Eirik stared at the child. This took his breath away. Never could he have imagined it. Eirik rode southward as the shades of evening gradually deepened to a pale grey spring night, and the birds sang jubilantly all through the forest. It was cool and good to ride at this late hour, and he had never been afraid to travel by night. And, to be sure, he was glad. But at the same time he was not a little dismayed. That Gunnhild should make good so wild a threat. Could any man have thought it? He saw quite clearly that now they would both be placed in a difficult position. If it became known whither Gunnhild had betaken herself, and that they had been there together, the worst would certainly be said. He must take her away from her sister's house as quickly as he could. But where could they seek refuge? The law was even as he had said. It was a bishop's duty to defend women against forced marriages. But very few bishops were ever called upon to fulfil this duty, even when their rule was a long one. He knew pretty well how welcome Gunnhild Bursesdatter would be made in the bishop's castle, or with the strict Lady Grower at Nonneseter, if she were sent thither. Ask any of his father's friends in the town, or in his home parish, to receive a woman whom he had carried off by force? That was impossible. Thorgrim and Una would do it, no doubt, but he could not drag them into such difficulties. And Ringel was too near both to Icelander and to Hestviken. For his own father would scarcely be better pleased with this than hers. The best plan he could think of was to take her to his kinsfolk in the uplands. He had not parted in friendship from Steinfinnsons of Berg, but he knew enough of his cousin to be sure that if he sought his support in such a case as this, he would find a loyal kinsman in Steinfinn. This plan involved difficulties enough. The way was long, and they might be pursued. And then, in God's name, the encounter could scarcely pass off without an exchange of blows. But if they had a start and travelled by unfrequented paths, there was more than that. He knew it well enough as he rode here in the spring night and breathed the acrid scent of growing leaves and grass and felt the warmth of his own sound, youthful body. Already he had visions of the chances he would have of kissing his fair bride and clasping her in his arms as they rode together unattended for 5 or 6 days and nights, through forests and remote country districts. But it was well he was old enough to know that he must be on his guard. What would be said of them he knew, but she must know it too, and yet she had chosen to accept this hazard. But to be forced to weep over a secret sorrow of his causing, he would not bring that on Gunnhild. His heart failed him at the memory of thoughts he had once had, No, in Jesu's name, Bothild was enough. It was clear he would have been wiser to have sent her back a message that she must not think of keeping so ill-considered a promise. But that would surely have offended her. And what kind of man would he have to be who should be capable of such prudence? If at least he knew where this nest was to be found. Somewhere on the border between Sana and Garda parishes. He had ridden past it once with old Tor when he was a lad. One saw the homestead on the farther side of a lake. Now he did not even know if he were on the right road. He was in the depth of the forest, where patches of snow gleamed here and there, and the birches had not yet burst into leaf. And the cold ground breathed the raw scent of early spring from the musty slime that covers the ground as soon as the snow recedes. It was already past midnight, and the song of birds, which had been silent a while, began to be heard again. But the notes of the night birds were not yet hushed. The night raven croaked, and in some bogs which he passed, the capercailzie was calling. Eirik was sleepy, and his horse was tired and a little lame. He leapt from the saddle and led his horse down a steep descent, where the water streamed over the path, past some small farms, and soon he came out upon a broader road. A little farther on, this road led past a little lake. The black forest surrounded the whole piece of water, except on the north side, where a solitary homestead stood on a point of land that jutted out into the lake. A mist was rising from the surface of the water, and from the marshy meadows around the homestead, so that only its green roof showed above the haze. From the head of the lake a track branched from the road across the marsh. Eirik rode along it. The worst bog holes were bridged with logs. The birches were dripping wet, with a strong and bitter scent of bursting leaves. He passed many places that had once been meadow, where young green fir trees had sprung up. The dawn was now so far advanced that the sky was white, and the surface of the water like steel between the driving mists. In the fields before the homestead, the grass was already high and lush, grey with moisture in the thick air, and here too birch and alder were almost in leaf. He could not wake folk in a strange place at this time of the morning, but he saw a little barn standing at the edge of the wood. He turned his horse loose outside, went in, and lay down in the empty barn. When he awoke, the sun was shining in through every crack of the logs. Outside the open door, all was gleaming green and gold in the sunlight. And in the doorway stood a woman, holding his horse by the forelock. Eirik sprang up, shook out his wrinkled cloak, went forward and greeted her. "Can you tell me, mistress, if this house be the Ness, where Eldred Bursesdatter lives?" As he spoke, he was sure that this must be Eldred. She was dressed like a working woman, and looked like, well, he knew not what, but not like a woman of the people. She was not very tall, not so tall as Gunhild, and thin, broader across the shoulders than across the narrow, scanty, mannish hips, and she held herself straight as a wand. Her brown, weather-beaten face looked as if the flesh had been scraped from under the skin. The forehead was smooth, as were the strongly arched cheekbones and the fine, straight nose. But the longer Eirik looked at this ravaged and ageing woman, the more clearly he saw that she must once have been beautiful. So beautiful that not one of all the fair women he had ever seen could compare with Eldred. "I am Eldred of the Ness. Have you an errand to me?" "I have, one that will seem strange to you, I fear." Then he told her who he was. "Are you a son of Olav Audunsson of Hestviken?" Her voice too was beautiful, rich and ringing. "You are not like your father. I remember him. He came home to these parts the year before I disappeared from—" She asked him to go up with her to the houses, and Eirik saw that the place looked well now that the sun was shining. Trees and meadows were nearly as far advanced as at home, but it was strangely deserted and lonely, and shut off with the dark forest behind it, which was beginning to invade the old meadowland, and the narrow lake in front, where the reflection of the high wooded slope on the south side darkened half the surface, even on a bright May morning like this. The ness upon which the houses stood was almost cut off from the shore by a neck of land so low that the water came over the grass on both sides. In flood time it came right across, Eldred told him. "Then you must use a boat?" "A boat?" Eldred laughed mockingly. "We have nothing to take us abroad, we who live here." The houses lay irregularly on the little mound, sitting where there had been room to build them. They were small and might have been kept in better repair. A bent old woman with her coif drawn low over her surly eyes glanced at the two as they went past. The walls of the dwelling houses were only 3 logs high. There was a penthouse of upright timbers which formed a sort of ante-room, and only a single room within. Instead of the central hearth there was a fireplace by the door, and the wall in that corner was covered with slabs of stone and daubed with clay. At each end of the other long wall was an untidy bed. Other furniture there was none, but upon the bench which ran round the walls all kinds of cups and platters, garments, pots, and a butter churn were piled in confusion. Eldred cleared a seat for him at the end of the room. "You must be hungry." He was. Now he remembered that since he rode from home the day before at noon, he had tasted nothing but a drink of milk at the cottage by Icelander. So he relished what Eldred set before him on the bench, curds, oaten bread and old cheese. Then he had to come out with his message. "I come from your sister, Eldred, from Gunhild of Icelander." "My sister?" Eldred gave him a strange look. Then she took a spindle from the jumble on the bench, thrust it into her belt, and began to spin. "That sister of mine, whom you name, I have neither seen nor heard from until now. And I wonder who can have spoken to her of me. Not her parents, I am sure." "What does she want, then?" "Gunhild, my sister." "She begs you to save her. They will give her to an old man, a widower whom she has never seen. And now she thinks, perhaps you will take pity on her. There is no one else in the world from whom she may look for kindness." Eldred looked at him, with the shadow of a smile on her brown and broken lips. And you? Maybe you are the one whom she would have." "It was agreed that I should be betrothed to Gunhild last winter, but then her father broke with us." "And maybe it was too late," said Eldred as before. Eirik guessed her meaning. He was annoyed with himself for turning red, but replied in an even tone. "Yes. So long as we thought we had only to wait a year or so, and the old people would have made up their differences, we should have been content. But if Burs will once more give his young hind to an old buck, he will find it is too late. He shall not so dispose of Gunhild. She will not submit, and I will not suffer that man to get her." "But what help do you look to me for?" asked Eldred. "Shall I go to Burs and invoke a curse on him?" Eirik had sat and watched her. Although she looked as if she had been dried over many fires, there was still something so fine about her. Her hair was not wholly hidden by the stiff coif. It was dark, streaked with grey, and a lock of it fell with a strange charm over the broad, smooth forehead, across which ran 2 sharp furrows. Hollow as her cheeks were, he had never seen anything more beautiful than the rounding of her jawbone and the curve of her chin. The eyes were deeply sunk in their great sockets, and there were many wrinkles about them, but they were large, dark, and grey. Her mouth was brown and scaly, with a deep red crack through the underlip, and the hands were red and cracked and knotted with gout. Yet he could not believe that everything he had heard about her was true. And even if she had erred gravely, they must first have wronged her cruelly. And however that might be, it was a pitiable sight to see this fair and high-born woman, banished and ageing, dwelling in so miserable a cabin. Then he began and told her the whole story of his courtship from beginning to end. "So it was she who sent you hither?" "Yes." "And you expect her to keep her word and come hither?" "Yes. But if you will tell us of a place where we can find lodging till she be rested, we will gladly betake ourselves thither, if you would rather have it so." "If I am afraid to have anything to do with this affair, you mean?" Eldred laughed. "Rather will Gunhild be afraid when she comes from Icon and sees how her sister lives." "She will think as I do," said Eirik quietly. "It should not be so, and it must be mended." "Do you seek to tempt me with a reward?" asked Eldred mockingly. "I don't know if you would call it a reward, if I can do what I can to see my sister-in-law righted. I have heard that your brother tried, but he fell." Eldred let her hands sink into her lap. But then she said, "You seem to have no fear of defiling yourself, Eirik, if you touch pitch. But if you purpose ever to be reconciled with Burs, you must throw over that brother-in-law of yours who deals in stolen goods, and the sister-in-law who is a whore. Oh, yes, Burs was the first of all men who called me by that name, and he told no lie of his best friend's wife. Better that no man hear of it, if it should come about that you lie with your young bride at the Ness any night." "I thought to ask one other boon of you," said Eirik. "I will ask you to show Gunhild such kindness as to ride north in our company. No one will think it of you that you sold your young sister to dishonour." Slowly Eldred's face flushed red. But then she laughed. "I should have to ride my grey bull then. I don't have a horse." "My horse will carry both Gunhild and me," said Eirik imperturbably, "till we get one for you on the way." Eldred only laughed again. "Must you do your spring husbandry here without a horse?" asked Eirik after a while. "Or do you borrow one from your neighbours?" "I have mattock and spade," replied Eldred shortly, "and a basket and pannier." Now he was told that she lived here alone with the old hag he had already seen, a palsied old man who was her kinsman. She had taken him in because he was Burs's enemy, and a half-grown lad who herded for her and helped with whatever there might be. "But then we must seize the opportunity while I am here with my horse," said Eirik. And when she would not hear of it, he laughed and said she must take it as if she had a brother come to the house. Then he jumped up and ran out. When she came out a while after, she found him down in the cornfield, where only a little work had been done in one corner. He had dragged out an old plough, and was engaged in putting it in order so that he could harness his horse to it. His long cloak and his blue holyday kirtle lay on the ground, and Eirik stood in nothing but a red homespun shirt, short breeches, long hose, and riding boots. "Are you going to plough in those boots?" asked Eldred. "No. If you could lend me something else to wear on my feet, it would be better." "How old are you?" Eirik Olafsson?" asked Eldred. "Oh, I am not young. 29. One would not think you were 19. "When I was 19, replied Eirik with a laugh, "I was far wiser, as folk reckon." Late in the afternoon, Eirik said he would ride northward to see if anyone was in sight. "How do you think she would come hither?" asked Eldred. Eirik said he didn't know. Perhaps she had someone at the manor who was faithful to her. "I believe you think she will come." Then she said, "It will be late before you come back." "No," said Eirik. His horse was tired. "But I can go into the barn and lie there, as I did last night." "No," said Eldred curtly. "It is not often we have guests here, but since you are come, I will not suffer you be treated otherwise than is fitting. I will make ready the outer bed for you, and leave the door unbolted." It was nevertheless later than he thought when he returned. A white mist was rising from the water and the bog as he rode across from the end of the lake. All was still at the homestead. Eirik stole in quietly. The room was dark and warm. He guessed that Eldred was in bed. He had not said his hours since prime, so he knelt at the foot of the bed and prayed. 7 paternosters for each of the lesser house, 15 for vespers, and 7 for compline. The last he said for her who gave him hospitality. He had seen something of her loneliness, and he swore that if it were in his power, he would better her condition. He had taken off his outer garments and was climbing into bed when Eldred's voice came from the far corner. "I have left milk and food for you on the hearth. You played truant from your supper." "Thanks, I am not hungry. It was ill of me to wake you." "Is it your practice every evening to pray so long?" she asked again. "Yes, but I have told you I had as lief sleep in the barn. Then I shall not disturb you with my practices." "No, you may freely keep your practices for me." The days went by. When Eirik thought of Hestviken and Saltviken and of his people there, it all seemed strangely far away and long ago. He wondered at times what they could think had become of him, and he wondered a little how Gunhild would contrive to come hither. Now it would soon be a week. But he felt it was as it should be, that he was living here at this strange and lonely homestead in the depth of the dark forest. Every morning when he came out, the nest lay like an island in a sea of white mist, and above it rose the hills, dark with firs. Then came the sun and drove away the mist, and all day long it shone on these awakening fields. The corn that she had sown before he came was already green, and the leaves grew denser in the thickets, and the grass in the meadow was long and glossy. He determined to do all the work for her that he could find, and there was enough to put one's hand to here. Her poverty astonished him. She had scarcely any meal in the house, and of her cows 3 gave no milk, and the other 2 but little, though they were in better condition than most cows in springtime. She had pasture for many more cattle than she owned. Most of the sheep had been taken by wild beasts the year before, and her corn had frozen. Houses and implements were as might be expected in a place where there was no man and no horse to bring in materials of any sort. To make up for the shortage of food, she had nets in the lake and snares in the woods, and Eirik undertook to look after both for her. It dawned on Eirik that this place had a strangely familiar air, as though he had once lived here long ago. It was the first home he could remember that now came back to him. It was long since he had thought of it, but now it stood forth. That too had been a place far out of the way and deep in the forest, but he did not recall any water, and Eldred became merged in a strange way with a dream he had had when a child. Of a woman in a blue mantle, half human and half bird. He had been afraid of her, but she was beautiful too, and he had called her Leman, for he was so small he did not know the meaning of that word, but he thought it was something that flew. And he had confused this dream vision with his mother. He didn't know how it was, but now it came over him that the Ness was like that first place he remembered in the world, and Eldred reminded him of Leman in his dream. Every evening he rode out along the road by which he had come to meet Gunhild, and back he came across the marshes when evening had deepened to grey spring night, and the white mist from lake and meadows was rising about Eldred's farm. On the 7th day it clouded over. There had been some showers, but toward evening the sun gleamed fitfully over the Ness. Eirik was sawing up some logs which lay on the woodpile. From where he stood he could see Eldred at the door of the byre. She was calling in her cows. Last of all came the little shaggy grey bull, splashing through the mire. Eldred waited for its coming, laid her hands on its cheeks, and leaned her forehead caressingly against the bull's head. Eirik went in to put on his kirtle and cloak. There was food left for him on the step of his bed. She took care now that he had something before he rode out. He did not hear anyone coming until the horses were just outside the house. Then he started up and ran to the outer door. Outside, where drops of rain now glittered in the sunlight, 2 men had dismounted from their horses. The second one, a young lad, swung himself into the saddle, took his master's horse by the bridle, and rode off into the fields. But the first was a tall, elderly man of fine presence. It was Guttorm from Dramtorp, and he hurried in out of the rain. "'Tis well nigh more than I had looked for," he said as he stepped into Eldred's house, "that you should be here." Eirik had turned white in the face. "Have you come?" "Yes, it is I who have come. Gunhild has yet so much kindness for you, though God knows how you deserved it, that she turned to me, and not to her father or her brothers. You may well suppose they would have not met you without drawn swords in their hands. I should have liked that better." Involuntarily Eirik's hand went to his sword hilt. "Silence with such talk. Can you expect we should think much of your manhood? Do you call it manly to try to entice the child out of her kinsman's keeping to such a den as this? This is her sister's house. Did you think Gunhild would submit to be ruled by you because she is sister to Eldred? But they are not daughters of the same mother. Can you not say what you have to say, Guttorm, without abusing a woman?" "You may be right there. Not many words are needed either. Gunhild bade me give you back this. That says enough, I think." Eirik took what Guttorm handed him, scarcely looking at it. Then he let the gold brooch drop, and it fell at his feet. Guttorm spoke again, sadly. "Yes, it made me angry to hear this, Eirik Olavsson. Never would I have thought such a thing of the son of so upright and franklin as Olav is. I took you for an honourable man. I believed you on your bare word, though appearances were against you." "You don't believe me now?" "We will not speak of that," replied Guttorm hotly. "I have delivered my message, and now I will go." Then he flared up. "How would you have me judge your conduct toward my niece? You have lain in wait by the fence like a barn-door thief, decoyed the child out to you late at night, visited her at the satyr, and sat with her alone in the hut as if she were a hireling. Do you hear? she had to make a clean breast of how she came by your brooch. And because she is innocent and childlike, you thought you could decoy her to you, here. Will you not greet the mistress of the house, man? Cried Eirik furiously. Eldred had come in, clad as she was when she came from the byre. Calmly and proudly she returned Guttorm's greeting. You have received a message from my sister, Eirik? She asked gently. Yes, I have brought him a message. But so far as I understand you, Master Guttorm, this sister of mine has told you it was Eirik's device that they should seek refuge with me. Eirik told me it was Gunhild who prayed him to come hither, saying she would follow. Did he say that? Eirik himself replied. He was pale, even to the lips. Yes. Shame on you, then, Guttorm spat. Eldred spoke. That is what Eirik said, and that he purposed, as soon as she was rested, to take her away to his rich kinsfolk in the uplands. Give the maid into their charge until he might be reconciled with Burs. I believe he also thought that Gunhild had chosen unwisely when she appointed this as their trysting place. Gunhild has heard nothing of his rich kinsfolk in the uplands, so far as I know, but it is not amiss if he has since thought better of his design. Eirik said calmly and earnestly, Does it seem so strange to you, Guttorm? It is known to every soul in the parishes hereabout that Burs sold his eldest daughter to Jephthah's daughter in the Bible had a better bargain than the mistress here. I had conceived a love for Gunhild, and I know she liked me well. When therefore I came to hear that Burs had allotted the same fate to her, would give her to a hideous ancient who had already worn out one wife at least. What stuff is this? Guttorm interrupted angrily. Old? He's a year or two older than you, a courteous and goodly man. Yes, he was married before he was of age, but Mistress Hilleborg lived but a year or two. Was it when she heard this of her new bridegroom, asked Eldred, that my sister gave up her sinful project and took counsel of you? No, replied Guttorm reluctantly, dropping his voice. I got wind that the child meditated a mischief. But since she has seen Magnus, she must needs admit that her father has sought to provide well for her in every way. But enough of this. Good night. No. Tarry a while, master. Eldred followed Guttorm out. In a few moments she came back. Eirik had not moved. No, he would neither rest nor take food, she said. She looked up at the tall, dark man who loomed hugely in the dim light of the room. Now I think it will be long before you believe a woman's word again, she asked with something like mockery. Eirik turned from her and went out. It was now raining quietly and steadily, and the growing scent of spring seemed even heavier in the wet evening. Eirik thought that now he could only leave this place. But he felt so strangely weak and empty, almost as when he had been stabbed with knives up at Haugsvik and came near to bleeding to death. He wandered along a path through the meadow down toward the lake. He thought of taking the boat and rowing somewhere. Then Eldred came running after him in great haste and seized him by the arm. Eirik, where are you going? Man, you do not think to drown yourself for such foolishness as this. No. He shook her hand off. I had not thought of that. Come up now, Eldred begged him. Don't go moping here in the rain. Eirik looked at her. Then, rather unwillingly, he went back with the woman. She had heaped fuel on the fire. The light of the flames played over the walls and roof in the low room with the heavy beams, under which a grown man could not stand upright, except under the roof tree. Eirik drank a little of the milk she offered him, absently thinking it was not so bad to have the fireplace in the corner as here. The rain did not fall into the fire when the smoke vent was open as now. "Let us go to rest," Eldred said then. "You need no more ride out at night." Eirik undressed so far as was his habit. But then he remained sitting on the bench at the foot of his bed, with his arm around the carved horse's head, staring at the embers which shrank together in the fireplace. Eldred already lay under the skins in her bed. "Lie down now," she bade him more than once, and Eirik answered yes, but stayed where he was. Then she sprang out again and came over to him, barefooted, in her coarse dark underkirtle. She seized him by the shoulders, forced him to sit upright, so sharply that his neck struck against the log of the wall. "Do not sit staring like this," she said impatiently. "You have a lot to learn yet, Eirik." "Learn?" He took hold of her wrist. "Shall I learn of you, maybe?" She looked down into his distorted face. Her nostrils expanded and her eyes grew wide. "Oh, yes, I could teach you so much." Then he pulled her down to him and crushed her broken lips with kisses.